Good morning and welcome to those of you joining us here for this conversation on monitoring, reporting, and verification framework for climate finance tracking. I know it is a challenge for those of us who are here at COP28 to get into the early morning discussion, so I really appreciate the fact that we do have some of you who have made it to the conversation. The 2015 Paris Agreement highlighted the need for climate finance measurement, reporting, and verification systems, and transparency as core aspects in the effective implementation of countries' national determined contributions. For the Caribbean region, there is no common MRVS that can consolidate the pipeline investment details among the different climate funds. However, in 2020, the Caribbean Development Bank, acting as delivery partner, supported four of its borrowing member countries, Belize, Haiti, Jamaica, and St. Kitts Nevis, with the development of a multi-country online MRVS to track climate finance flows. This system, developed through a GCF Readiness Grant, can be scaled up to other countries in the region. The discussion this morning is therefore timely as it aims to obtain the perspectives of participants on the importance of MRVS to better track and report on climate finance flows for climate change actions. That said, let me now introduce our panelists for this event. Mr. Omar Alcock holds a BSc in Mathematics and a Master of Science in Economics, both from the University of the West Indies. In addition, he holds several other professional designations in project management, energy, and GHG emissions. His professional experience spans the financial, educational, and public sectors, and he possesses expertise in energy modeling, analysis and planning, commodity market analysis, and climate and renewable energy financing. He currently serves as the acting principal director with responsibility for coordinating and monitoring activities related to climate change in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation in Jamaica. He is also a negotiator for Jamaica at COP and sits on several constituted bodies of the UNCCC process. Dr. Colin Young, of course, who needs no introduction, is a Belize national. He's the executive director of the Caribbean Center for Climate Change since January 2020. Prior to his appointment at 5Cs, Dr. Young served as the CEO for the Social Security Board, CEO in the Ministry of Agriculture, CEO in the Ministry of Energy, and of course, he sits on numerous boards. He has served, including the GCF. He holds a Master of Science and a Doctor of Philosophy in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, both from the University of Connecticut in the USA. Let's give them a welcome. Okay, so my first question, Omar, is to you. How do you see MRV system enhancing the way countries make decisions regarding the development of climate change plans and policies?
So, good morning. Um, I guess it would be prudent to, first of all, thank the CARICOM Secretariat for hosting the event here at the pavilion. To thank as well the CDB for seeing the need to have this kind of a discussion for the region. And of course, to the 5Cs for continuing to support what is being done in the region as we try as best as we are able to tackle this, what I call monster crisis called climate change. So Jamaica is very pleased to be here and welcome any engagements that could be afforded to have further discussion where that is concerned. And so for us, as relates to MRV, as you did mention the Paris Agreement, it is a part of our requirement to produce reports on some kind of frequency in an effort to indicate where we are as it relates to mitigation, adaptation, financing, capacity development, and so on. And for us, the best way to do that is to develop what is being termed a monitoring, reporting, and verification system. And so we have seen the need for that. And we see where the development of such a system will also be able to assist as relates to the development of strategies, plans, policies, to be better able to enable our institutional framework. What it also does is to assist us to identify as well any gaps that might exist in the system. So where we have a framework that is clear on what the requirements are, we are also able to identify where we can't meet the requirements. And so with that, be able to put things in place to be able to better do the reporting that is required under the agreement, and even for us, just to be better able to develop as a country. So that's one. And it also assists in terms of identifying any other challenges that may be encountered and to assist the countries to ask themselves the relevant questions. As a country, are we targeting the right areas to tackle the challenges that should come or before us? Are we collecting the right types of data and information to be able to properly report based on the requirement? And so these are some of the things that I believe a MRV system assists us to do in country. Constraints related to collection and collation and then reporting is an important factor, because if you don't know, then you can't plan. You don't know, you can't produce the adequate strategies and policies to put in place. If you don't know, you can't inform those who are to make the decisions. And so I believe the MRV system helps as relates to that as well.
Thank you, Omar. So, Colin, you would have heard Omar elaborate on the importance of an MRV system to the whole national planning ecosystem. From your perspective, do you think that an MRV climate finance system will help to increase the trust between donors and country recipients?
Thank you, Isaac. And indeed, I want to thank the CDB as well for the invitation to be a part of this panel discussing this very important topic. That question about trust between donors and recipient countries is an important one. And I want to step back a bit, because we're talking about a monitoring, reporting, and verification platform or framework for climate finance. But really, there is not a clear functional definition of climate finance. In fact, if you heard yesterday, they were talking about the fact that from 2020, developed countries were to be providing 100 billion a year in climate finance, which they have not yet met. And every COP we come and they say, okay, well, we're closer to the 100 billion, but then Oxford and Oxfam and other entities will tell you that whatever number you're hearing from the OECD is half that. So what are we monitoring? What are we reporting on? And what are we verifying? So if we are going to have an MRV framework, the understanding and the definition that the donor has for climate finance ought to be the understanding and the definition that the recipient countries have for climate finance. If there's a difference between the two, then you're not going to have trust and you're not going to have the transparency that is required, because they're supposed to be providing about 100 million in public finance and private finance and so on. But if you are not identifying what exactly is climate finance, then you're going to over-allocate and over-claim and over-count climate finance. So I think that has been an issue. In fact, Omar is a negotiator, and he would know that repeatedly we have the developed countries who are fighting against actually defining climate finance. It ought to be very simple, right? I mean, mitigation is simpler. Adaptation is a little bit more challenging because there's so many aspects of adaptation. But if I'm giving you $1 million for X, Y, and Z, you should be able to tell me what that is, and we should be able to see whether that $1 million is actually contributing to reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or adaptation to climate change. And then we can count it. But if you give me $10 million in grants for adaptation and $30 million in loans, non-concessional at market rates, then, and you label that climate finance, then there is a massive issue, and we have to be very careful within CARICOM to be able to have an MRV system that then falls into this trap of earmarking and tagging those types of financing as climate finance. Because what it does then, it feeds into the narrative from the developed countries that they are in fact providing climate finance to the region when the majority of it is actually in loans. So our developing countries who are already at the front line of climate change, who have little fiscal space to be able to invest in adaptation and mitigation, are now being forced to take on loans and go further in debt to deal with the adaptation crisis. And then now on our balance sheet and our MRV system, we will be saying, okay, we get X amount of climate finance, when in fact, a lot of that is in loans. So when you look at the international, and I heard in the video that we saw earlier, 600 billion in climate finance. We have to be very careful as CARICOM and Caribbean and SIDS, because if you were to look at that 600 billion and you ask the question, how much of it is actually grants, how much of it is concessional loans, how much of it is non-concessional loans, how much of it is equity, and you start to break that down, you would realize that the vast majority of it is actually non-concessional resources. And so while it can be, if it's going towards saying reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, perhaps that's a tag, but then that should not be counted towards the 100 billion targets that we're trying to reach. So trust is very important. Transparency and accountability are required for there to be trust. And unless we define what is required and what it actually is climate finance, it is hard to build trust as part of the process. And we have to be careful that we are not tagging and identifying financing as climate finance when it in fact may not be, and it may actually be development finance.
Okay. Okay, so thank you, Carolina. That was very interesting. I'm going to ask Omar an interesting question related to what he just said, but I need to ask you a follow-up though. If it is that we are moving as a region in the same direction to adopt the same MRV, notwithstanding the looseness in definition as you described it just now, if I understand you well, at least it gives us a little bit more leverage in the conversations we're having with donors as well, doesn't it?
Yes, and again, it goes to the trust. You see, it's always been a one-sided, sort of asymmetric conversation, because in order for us, when I say us collectively, CARICOM member states, to access resources from MDBs or from bilateral sources or from the financial mechanisms of the UNFCCC, like the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund, we have to be transparent. Mm-hmm. They want to know everything about what is happening in terms of the government. But on the other side, the donors are not being transparent as to the sources of these financing and whether they're in fact, in terms of the reporting, climate finance, or whether they're new and additional, mm-hmm. right? Because that's the other aspect. You should not be counting ODA, and you should not be counting non-concessional loans at market rates as climate finance. But when they give us a loan, or they lend us a loan, and then we have to repay, now on the other end of reporting, they now count that as climate finance. And that is the issue. So you're absolutely right. If we have a system of tracking and we are using the same methodology to track, then what we can start to do is to be able to speak with a sort of a confidence, mm-hmm. that, you know what, only X amount of these resources that have flowed into the region over this year and next year and the other year is actually climate finance according to the UNFCCC. Right, and that is going to help, because when you have, one of the things that the 5Cs has been working on is that, you know, countries have their NDCs. And some countries like Jamaica and Belize are two of the countries that have already costed their NDCs. We know how many billions it's going to require to implement those activities. Countries now need to go another step. What they need to develop now is a financing strategy to finance that NDC. And in that financing strategy, it's going to articulate how much of grant resources, how much of loans at concessional resource, whether there's equity, whether there's debt for climate swaps, whether there's other innovative financial instruments. And then, because they're attached to now your NDCs, adaptation and mitigation, there is now a system in which that can be recorded as climate finance. And then we can say, as the Caribbean, in the negotiations, and we can then arm our negotiators like Omar and those in the climate finance space with the data to say to the donors that, wait, you know, there is this lack of coherence in terms of what is being reported by you to the financial mechanism, as opposed to what the countries are receiving for climate finance.
Okay, thanks, Colin. So, Omar, my next question is to you, and of course, you're free to comment on anything you heard from Colin. In fact, I don't think the next question I'm going to ask you will force you to respond to some of what Colin just said. So, how could the MRV system support Jamaica's reporting requirements to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and enhance your compliance with international climate change commitments?
All right, so thanks. So the only statement I'll make to add to what Dr. has already said, if you say you're going to do something, do it. That's how you build trust. If you say you're going to provide 100 billion, provide 100 billion. I mean, it's that simple. And when you provide 100 billion, as Doc said, it has to be 100 billion that is actually working for the parties that have access to that 100 billion. And then the next problem is the access. If the 100 billion is available and you can't access it, it don't make no sense. That also erodes trust. And so for us, even as negotiators, and I know I'm detracting a bit from the question, but even as negotiators, it's a part of the problem in the room. You tell us today, and tomorrow it's a different story. And for trust, do what you say you're going to do. So that's the only thing I think I'd add to that. But to respond to the question, so countries are expected to prepare national reports, national inventory reports, biannual update reports, national communications, and by the end of next year, biannual transparency reports. Now, to be able to do all of those reports, or any of those reports, you have to have some effective or efficient system in place to be able to collect the information and the data. Now, these reports have some specifications as to the types of data and information that we're expected to report on. It's a part of the requirement. And it's used at the end of the day to judge the effectiveness of the system under UNFCCC, to find out whether or not persons are actually doing what they say they would have done or doing what they should be doing. So for instance, well, we kind of exhausted the matter as it relates to finance, but we are also expected to report on the type of financing that we're either getting or as a government expending from our own coffers. And so that is a part of the reporting. We're also expected to report on how it is we have been enhancing the levels of capacity in country. So whether it's through training, sensitization, awareness, we are expected to report on that, right? How have we made population, the private sector, persons in governance more aware or more able to combat this thing called climate change? The other matter, of course, is the inventory. We don't know where we are as it relates to emissions unless you do an inventory. And so we're expected to do a GHG inventory ever so often when we're preparing these reports. And there's a particular methodology that has to be followed in an effort to prepare the inventory. For us, we typically follow the IPCC methodology, 2006 if memory serves correct. And it outlines very clearly how the emissions are to be calculated based on the sectors. So whether it's energy, industrial production, process use, waste, AFALU, agriculture, forestry, land use, or change, it identifies how to do those calculations, and that assists in meeting the reporting requirement. We also are expected to indicate what kind of mitigation actions we have been undertaking. So how have you been contributing to the reduction, the sequestration, or the capture of emissions? So we report on those as well. Have we been putting in place solar plants, wind power plants, or have we been taking off the electricity grid as an example? Fossil fuel-based plants as well. So that's mitigation. Adaptation as well. What have you been doing to build the resilience of the country? So very recently we produced our adaptation communication, and when we finish our 4th national communication, which we are in the process of preparing now, it will also have enhanced elements of adaptation in it. So these are just some, right? I think we could probably take the whole session to discuss. But these are just some of the things that MRV system could assist with. Because if you put that system in place, then you're better able to track all of those activities that we have been mentioning: the finance, the mitigation action, the resilience building, the capacity building, the training that has taken place. And once you have all of that in one area collated, you can then spit out or be able to disseminate very readily a report to be able to share or to commit as the country's experience to the UNFCCC and the international community.
Thanks, Thomas. So you have practically answered the next question I was going to ask you, but I'm still going to put it anyway, just so that you could outline to us any additional benefit that you're aware of that the country could derive from putting an MRV system in place. I mean, you have spoken a lot about the tracking and the monitoring and the reporting. Are there any additional benefits that you think can be derived from implementing the MRV system?
All right, so for us personally, in the development of the MRV system, there are several things that could emanate from that. So, for instance, we are trying to put in place a knowledge platform which will be able to collect and to disseminate all information to anyone who is able to access the platform. The intention is for it to be a public platform, so then it can be accessible to anybody once they have those rights. And that platform will highlight everything that is happening, at the very least, nationally, as relates to climate change. The intention as well is to produce a functional GHG inventory database management system. And that as well will assist as relates to tracking. Doc spoke about NDCs. We are expected to, in some of those reporting requirements, indicate where we are as relates to meeting the obligations that we identified or the commitments that we identified under our NDC. And so with that inventory system in place, we'll be better able to do that. We also have been engaging the academic community to put in place training programs to assist persons to better understand and to be better qualified as relates to understanding and implementing MRV systems, and also in terms of being able to do the calculations required for GHG inventory systems. Because what often happens is that we have to projectize, the development, the collection of the data and the preparation of reports. But with a dedicated system in place and trained cohort of persons available, then we won't necessarily have to rely so much on, contract work from persons outside the region. Because oftentimes it's the persons outside the region that are mostly familiar with how to develop these reports. So that's some of the things that we are trying to accomplish, and hopefully before the end of next year, we'll be able to do that.
Fantastic. So, Colin, having listened to Omar elaborate, and of course I did speak earlier to the support we're providing to the 4 countries to implement the MRV system. What I wanted to get from you, what role do you think 5Cs can play in helping to establish the system throughout the region, and what resources would the center need to help to support the establishment of a regional system?
Thanks, Isaac. And just before I go to that question, I want to pick up on something that Omar had said, which I think is extremely important, and that is the mechanism to report on the national expenditure that countries are making to deal with the effects of climate change or the loss and damages caused by climate change. Because the MRV systems that the CDB through the GCF readiness is putting in the countries allows countries to, in a sense, track the financing that is coming in primarily, but during a year, there would be impacts from floods, impacts from droughts, maybe even hurricanes and storms, and governments now have to find money, whether that's a combination of loans or recurrent revenues, to then build back the bridge, fix the street that's been washed out, provide resources to farmers, and generally those are not recorded and counted and collated so that the countries can demonstrate to donors what is it that they're already spending to try to deal with the effects of climate change. So I think a good MRV system is going to be one that, obviously, as I said, is going to capture what we want it to capture, and hence the reason why the definition is going to be very clear and important. And then it should be capturing both the national expenditure and resources that are put towards climate change, and then, of course, the international. Now, the 5Cs, as an accredited entity, we help countries to mobilize climate finance for climate resilient development. And we are working in multiple countries, in fact 12 countries right now across the region. But the truth is that the 5Cs at any one moment in time is only seeing a portion of the climate finance portfolio in each of the member states. And that information that we need often when we're building the proposal, it's found in multiple places within the member states. And one would think that maybe just the Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Economic Development, but really there are also what we call CAP 2 resources and CAP 3 resources in budgets that are not necessarily in one place. So I think one of the things we are very good at, we have the regional clearinghouse mechanism at the 5Cs, which is the largest repository of Caribbean-specific climate data. And we have a number of various platforms and tools. And it would be great if we could have that platform to be used to capture this information. But what we find over the years, and I know there are people in the room who would know this because of the role that they've played, like my friend here from CDB, getting that information from a person or persons within ministries is very tedious and lengthy. So I think what we need is, when Omar talked about all of the reports that have to be submitted, and many of our countries are slow in getting those reports into the UNFCCC. But once those reports are in, then the information can be extracted from those reports, and then it appears now on a dashboard platform that allows us to track it. The other issue that we have to deal with is the transparency of the debt from within our countries. Because sometimes countries would borrow money from bilateral partners, but oftentimes those loans are discussed in the cabinet and the approvals that are needed, but then it's very difficult to get information as an outsider about what is the purpose of those loans. So we, as a 5Cs, obviously we can work with our countries to help capture that information, to then help to build a narrative of the inadequacy, really, of the amount of climate finance that we're getting to help build the moral imperative as well as a technical justification of why is it that we need to crowd in more climate finance. I think the platforms are there. We just need to be able to have access to the information and to get the cooperation of member states to be able to populate and to utilize the MRV systems, because that's another thing. We spent a lot of money, when I say we collectively, we spent a lot of money building tools and building platforms, and then we have the challenge of actually ensuring that the data gets in to the platform. And therein, we have had to, for example, provide member states and some departments with scanners to be able to, and resources to pay people to actually do the work to help put this information in the platform. So there are resources that are going to be required, and we see that it usually starts off very well, and then after a while there is a decrease in the inputting of the information. So if I was to look at country X and the budget is approved for the next financial year, what we would really want is from recurrent resources, from CAP 2, from CAP 3, from the loans that you get and the grants that you're getting, somebody has to be able to put that information in the MRV system. And then that now has to be accessible. And once that's accessible, now what a 5Cs can do, along with a CDB, because the CDB is also an accredited entity, is that we can pull that information to be able now to use it as a justification in the proposals and the programs that we're developing for our member states.
Thank you very much, Colin. You have gone in a space where we could talk all day about it. I'm still going to come back to the point that you just made that I really want to ask both you and Omar about. But before I go there, let me ask Omar. So Jamaica is developing its own national MRV. Do you see this national MRV operating within a broader regional MRV framework?
All right, so thank you. Certainly, if we are successful in developing our national MRV, we don't have an issue in sharing experiences in developing that MRV. And in sharing that experience as well, there are other countries in the region which will feel a little bit more encouraged to also develop a MRV. Now, a part of the negotiating machinery that is successful, at least for SIDS, is that there's strength in numbers. And so even at the regional level, if we are able to collate based on the information provided by each of those countries, because they have a system in place to collect and disseminate the information, it gives more credence, reliability, it gives more power to the region as it relates to being able to identify what is, what was, what is not. And so I personally don't have an issue with having a regional infrastructure or framework in place to be able to have the countries feed into that, depending on feasibilities and compatibilities and all of that. So that generally answers the question. But I wanted to touch, I think, on two things that mentioned. So a part of the problem we have experienced is that you mentioned the infrastructure work and the financing going there. For us, when the agency with responsibility for road works or for infrastructure works submit their budget, it's submitted as a capital budget. It's not submitted as a climate change related activity. And so it's not tagged as such. And so that for us is a part of the problem, which we're trying to resolve. Because if you don't properly tag the government expenditure items as climate change items, you can't properly monitor what is being spent by government on the related issue. And so climate tagging is one of the areas that we have been embarking on with the Ministry of Finance, and we're hopeful that in the not too distant future, we'll be able to identify differently what is climate change from what is being spent on everything else in government. The other issue for us is that persons generally don't even understand the climate change space, much less climate finance. And so there's some work I think we're going to have to do in the region as it relates to sensitizing and making more aware, you know. So for instance, a very basic example, there is a lot of energy projects taking place to improve efficiency and improve conservation, but persons don't readily identify the fact that you're putting in more AC units because the place is warmer, and the place is warmer because there's global warming. It's global warming because there's a change in the climate. So simple things like these, and we identify a myriad of solutions, putting on films on the windows and the doors to reduce the irradiation and so on. And there's financing related to that, but it's not identified as a climate change related activity. So there's much, I think, to be done in the region to assist us to be better able to track and monitor what is happening. We have started as relates to the progress of some of that, but much more is still left to be done.
Thanks, Vera. So I think that is a segue into the question I wanted to ask, and I'm going to draw on your experiences here. So I know, Colin, you have been a CEO in the Ministry of Agriculture, in the Ministry of Energy, so you know well how the budget formulations take place. And Omar, you have been involved in energy modeling. And we know a critical and crucial part of any MRV system would be data. And at CDB, we have been saying for a while that we have to measure better to target better. And data throughout the region has been our Achilles heel, really. Could you locate what you're saying about the climate finance tracking in that broader context of how we treat data in the region?
I see Uname just showed that came, and she's been as part of this process for a long time. So one of the reasons the 5 Cs was set up, in fact, one of our first mandate was the issue of trying to look at what the data gaps were, and then try to build out those gaps to be able to then get to the point of using the data for evidence-based decision making, right? So I think over the last 15 years, we have come a long way in finding and bridging the data gaps. And now the data that we have, we are now able to put it together in terms of a climate rationale to be able to secure climate financing. Now, there's still a lot that needs to be done, because while the data may exist, it is actually quite dispersed. And sometimes it's not accessible easily electronically. So we've had to, for example, work with countries to digitize a lot of the data that they have, especially hydrometeorological data. The GCF, for example, wants you to have a 30-year time series of hydrometeorological data going back, right? So they want to see rainfall patterns over 30, and not just daily, but high intensity, right? They want to be able to see whether or not the problem you're trying to solve is in fact caused by climate change. And so having 5 years of data does not sort of give that narrative for a climate time horizon. So we have been working along with places like CIMH, working with entities out of Cuba, the UK Hadley Research Center, and the Met offices within the various countries. We've installed over 200 automatic weather stations, for example, across CARICOM that provide real-time data to the Met offices, and that data is then used by CIMH in their climate services forecasting. So I think where we are at now, it's to maximize the use of the data that exists, and to ensure that the data that the 5Cs is hosting, because that's another challenge we have. So while we have the regional clearinghouse, the inputting and the updating of the data into the clearinghouse is an issue. Why? Because it's dependent on a person or persons within the various countries to do the uploading of the information. And people are absolutely stretched. So there's a structural issue here, is that it's not that they don't want to do it, it's that the person or persons who are identified to do this job is also doing 10, 15, 20 other things. And usually this is the one that is not done. And so we have been trying to improve the data infrastructure, because the donors, when it comes to climate finance, wants the data. And in fact, that has been a critical barrier to access to climate finance, is the access to the data so that we can put it into the climate rationale. And on the climate finance side, same thing, right? We don't have the data to be able to demonstrate to the donors how it is that we are using the climate finance, in quotes, that we're getting to program that climate finance against our NDCs or against our sustainable development goals, because there's a lack of coherence between how the money is treated when it's coming in, and how the ministry's budget. Because Omar rightly said, when I submit my budget, when I was a PS to the financial secretary, the greatest predictor of your budget next year is going to be what it was this year. And that budget is going to have X amount of money for capital expenditure, and there's no way of tagging it. So I think one way that might be quite useful, and perhaps this is something the CDB can try to facilitate, is almost as though we need to develop, and this is not being sort of top down at all, I'm saying this would be quite humbly, suggest to our member states a particular template of how resources can be tagged to identify climate finance, both when it's coming into the country and what countries are putting. Because you see what's happening now is Jamaica is developing their own. CDB, under the readiness, they developed 4 countries, and other countries are developing their own. But these platforms are not necessarily integrated, and they actually may be tracking and reporting on different types and sources of finance, and how they are recorded and how they account might be actually different. And so because it's different, the comparability of the data then becomes a challenge. And so we have 15 countries, all within CARICOM, in terms of the CARICOM member states. This is something I think that might be quite plausible and quite possible.
Omar, any observations, any feedback on the data requirements?
So I think, I was excited when I hear him mention that, yes, data may be available, but then is someone dedicated to sit and input that data and that information. That is the challenge. There's a significant capacity challenge in the region. There's much to do and not very many persons doing, right? That's one. When new systems are put in place, typically you hire, let's say, a civil servant. There is an already constructed job function or job description that they have to follow. That new system would not have been on that job description. And so the focus tends to be on the description. So until you change that structure, your problem not going to be solved. And we will continue to have the issue of not having consistent data and information be placed into the system. So that for us, I think, is a part of the challenge we currently face.
So thank you very much, Omar. Now you have opened up a very huge topic there in terms of the implementation deficit issue in the region. It is something that at CDB we are tackling head on. We understand that it is quite an ambitious undertaking given it's a structural issue that has been with us for some time. But I think in a high-level discussion yesterday, I think the Prime Minister of Barbados, the head of IDB, the president of CDB, all identified that if there is one regional common good that we should be focusing on, its implementation capacity. So I think that message has been spoken of at the highest level, and as I said, we do have work underway where that is concerned. I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask one question, then I'll come back to you for some closing remarks, and we'll wrap it up. Joseph, I knew you would have had a question.
Thank you so much. Very, very, very informative conversation. And even though I'm close to the area, I must say I've learned so much. So thank you very much. Two quick questions. So one, in the case of Jamaica, how far down do you go in terms of tracking? I'm thinking mitigation now, really. Like at a sector level. You know, let's say one industry decide to do significant work in energy efficiency and renewable energy and so on. Is there any way in your system to capture those kind of sub-sector, sub-industry data? That's one, part A. Part B is integrity, validation, over-reporting, under-reporting in terms of, obviously some countries, and this is more broadly now, not necessarily Jamaica, some countries may have an incentive to over-report in some things. How does the system protect against those kinds of biases and so on? Can you comment on those things?
So the first challenge for us is that we need to know. So if a major industry is doing some major retrofitting of its plant to move from heavy fuel oil or from diesel production to, the use of natural gas or some green hydrogen, for instance. If we don't know, we can't track it. So engagement with the private sector, engagement in the industry and NGOs and so on are important. I think that's one of the first steps, to know what they are doing. And then to indicate to them that a system exists where we encourage them to input the information. Because as it is now, even though we have an Access to Information Act and so on, there's nothing mandating them to report. And we only become aware when we engage. So that nuance needs to be resolved at some level, however, whether it's through legislation or regulation. That's the first hurdle, I think. Now, once we are aware, and once the system allows, then they can put in the information. We can provide the necessary credentials and so on when the system is up and running and fully functional for them to be able to input that information. And the hope is that when they continue to do that on a consistent basis, then they would have been developing a database even for themselves where they would be able to track and monitor what they as a company or they as a sector industry has been doing. So that's one of the positives that we try to sell. You might not have something in place, we have it in place, and you, with the credential, is able to access and see what you're doing and to keep track of it there. Yeah.
As you have the mic, 30 seconds, closing remarks.
Well, the MRV system is a requirement from the Paris Agreement. It is something that is necessary in an effort for us to identify where we are and possibly where it is we're going to end up. It is with evidence that you're able to do the necessary plan and strategies and put those in place. The IPCC reports, because of data and information that is available, is able to indicate that by 2025 we're not going to make the targets. By 2030 we're not going to make the 1.5 and so on. And so the MRV system assists with that, because then there's a structured way for us to collect the information and disseminate as is needed, whether it's locally or to our international communities, our development partners, and so on.
Great. Colin?
You know, the GCF has been set up for many years now, and they have dispersed over $12 billion, and SIDS have only gotten about 1.5 billion of that amount of money. And so the reason we have that data is that we're relying solely on what the GCF indicates in terms of reporting. We don't currently have a system that is able to track, and since this is about MRV for climate finance, to be able to track how those resources come in. And I want to end with what I started with. It is absolutely important that any MRV framework that is set up at the regional level within CARICOM, that the understanding of what climate finance is and what it is that we are actually monitoring, reporting, and verifying against is key. Because if we continue to rely on the fuzzy math and use and reporting against things like non-concessional market rate loans and count it as climate finance, we will be shooting ourselves in the foot. And so part of this is to build trust. To build trust, you need transparency and you need accountability. But it is very clear that if we can get past that sort of definitional issue, then obviously having such a system that governments can track what is coming in and what is it that they're actually spending with their own resources to catalog and document and to record climate finance, then that can help us in the fight of demanding more access to climate finance. And not loans, commercial loans, but highly concessional loans, grants, and other financial instruments like debt for climate swaps and debt for nature swaps and so on.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. It has been an absolute pleasure for me to share the platform with you this morning. Omar, I know you have to go. Thank you very much. But let me invite Valerie in the meantime to bring some closing remarks. Valerie, of course, is the Division Chief for Environmental Sustainability Division at CDB. Valerie?
Thank you very much, Isaac. I'm just going to make some brief comments on some of the key points that were raised this morning. I mean, we heard today that there is not a clear definition of climate finance, and it is important for donors and recipients to have a similar understanding of what that means. Right? This is the only way we could enable sustaining the sort of trust that we heard the panelists speak about between the developing countries or between the recipients and the actual donors. The MRV platform, we heard, is also an opportunity for sharing information to reduce duplication of efforts among donors and enhancing efficient use of the already scarce resources, financial resources that are available to the region. We heard that as a theme by leaders this week, as well as reinforced by the panelists. So in that case, the focus would be on gaps and the need to address those. So you're more targeting the resources to priority areas that can, to assist the countries to meet their climate resilience outcomes. Colin mentioned several times the need to ensure that the information is credible. In fact, all the panelists mentioned that. And so the MRV system, the online system for tracking the finance, actually includes not just the system itself, but it's also supported by methodologies and manuals for guidance on the processes, the procedures of the system, the training that we heard Omar mention from Jamaica that is absolutely necessary for appropriate use of it, and guidelines on a methodology for classifying climate finance, by addressing the concern that was mentioned several times on making sure that we're not comparing apples and oranges, but we're talking about apples and apples when we're speaking about climate finance. And so Like you said, we heard the importance of the need to have the system in place, the need to use the system. And so I'll just end by saying we really look forward to working with partners like the 5Cs, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, and other regional and bilateral donors to help with all of this accountability so we know what is own, you know, what the country's own resources that are being used as well as, and again, to help with the duplication, or avoid the duplication in the counting. So we look forward to working with as I said, the 5Cs, regional, bilateral, and other MDBs as well who have a stake in this. And to extend the online MRV plat system to other interested countries. It is important, we heard Jamaica talk about the importance of the awareness, to raise awareness of this tool, and to share experiences, and to encourage other countries, other SIDS, Caribbean SIDS, to establish national systems that are credible, that are transparent, with the understanding of the need for a regional and collaborative approach to tracking climate finance flows. So, audience, I thank you very much for your attention and for participating in this event.